Welcome to CMES Conversations, a series of interviews with leading scholars and thinkers, hosted by the Center for Middle East Studies at the University of Denver. Our guest on this edition of CMES Conversations is the Iranian philosopher Ramin Jahanbegloo. He is the York-Noor Visiting Chair in Islamic Studies and an Associate Professor of Political Science at York University in Toronto. His many books include Introduction to Nonviolence, The Clash of Intolerances, The Gandhian Moment, Democracy in Iran, The Spirit of India, In Search of the Sacred, Conversations with Isaiah Berlin, and his most recent book is Time Will Say Nothing. A philosopher survives an Iranian prison. Thank you for joining us once again on this episode of CMES Conversations.
Ramin, it is such a pleasure
Thank you so much.
to have you here in Denver,
Nice to be here.
to see you again after all these years. I'll never forget the first time we met, Ramin. I don't know if you remember it. It was in the year 2004. It was in Maryland, Bethesda, Maryland, at the conference of the International Society for Iranian Studies.
Yes, absolutely.
And we ran into each other in the hallway. I was then an editor for the magazine Open Democracy.
Yes.
And we were starting a series of dialogues for Open Democracy between thinkers in the Islamic world, writers, activists, poets, and Western thinkers and writers. And I believe the series was called Letters to America or something like that. And I asked you, I walked up to you very eagerly and I asked you if you would engage in this correspondence with the philosopher Richard Rorty.
Yes, absolutely.
And you were very eager, you immediately agreed to do it. You knew Rorty, you had actually invited him to Tehran.
Yes. Yeah, in 2003, yeah.
That's right. And let's go back for a moment, Ramin, in time to that period. It was in some ways a very special period.
Absolutely.
One of the ironies to me is that you represent, in many ways, a period in modern Iranian history associated with intellectual dialogue, openness. Now, in the minds of many, that period goes back to the election of Mohammad Khatami as president of Iran in 1997. He served 2 terms from 97 to 2005. But one thing I realized in reading your memoir is that you actually left Iran in 1997, the year that Khatami was elected, and you went to Canada.
Yes.
And so actually your time and Khatami's later overlapped, but at the beginning, you were actually in Iran for several years until Khatami's election.
Absolutely.
And then you left. So I'm just trying to kind of reframe, if you will, contemporary Iranian history, because your role with this NGO that you directed, I believe it was called the Center for Contemporary Studies.
Yes.
In Tehran. Talk a little bit about that time and what you did and what was the project, what was the goal of that period in your work, Ramin?
Well, actually, my links with Iran, post-revolutionary Iran, actually started in 1990s because after I finished my work, my philosophy and political science in France at Sorbonne, my father passed away in 1991. And since I was the only child of the family, my mother asked me if I can come back to Iran, go back to Iran eventually to help her out. And I went there and I decided to stay. In 1992, I went back to Iran. I decided to stay. And I was very active actually at that time, though I could not teach at the university, but I was actually working with different intellectuals, organizing lectures. We, when I say we, several friends who we already were very close in France, in Paris, in Europe. We started the journal Guftegu, which means dialogue. and
Morad Saghafi.
Yeah, Morad Saghafi and many others, and it was a very interesting time. I was working with this religious intellectual journal which was called Kian. I used to publish for them. I did an interview with Levinas, with Paul Ricoeur for them. I wrote myself in that journal. So I got to know a lot of intellectuals. I used to hang out also with Iranian filmmakers, and I did subtitles in French for 5 of the Iranian movies.
Interesting.
And I did several documentaries myself. And so I was very active, very, very active.
And part of the point of that journal, Guftagoo, for example, was, as you say in your memoir, to create a bridge between French intellectuals and Iranian intellectuals.
Absolutely. It was because most of us, we were very much influenced by the French, French mode of intellectualism. And we wanted to do, it was very close to the spirit of a journal which was called Esprit,
right.
Which was a left, I would say, center-left intellectual journal, which I still continue working with them, actually.
In Paris?
In Paris, and they're going to publish, actually, a part of my memoirs in French in the May edition. And so it was, and it's at that time that I started, before the years 2000, that I started inviting some intellectual from Europe and other places. Actually, I invited V.S. Naipaul. That was just before he won the Nobel Prize of Literature. That was in 1996. I invited in 1994 the director of that Esprit journal, Olivier Mongin. I invited Paul Ricoeur, who was a French philosopher, very famous philosopher. And it's because the idea was somehow to establish this bridge, intellectual bridge between Iran and the outside world, especially on the intellectual and cultural basis. And that was practically 3 years before Khatami came to power. So I always believe that Khatami is the consequence of the work of the civic actors and the Iranian civil society.
More the consequence than the cause.
Than the cause, yes.
Although in turn, you could say it was sort of a two-way street, right?
Yeah.
Because in many ways, you and your colleagues in journals like Guftagoo paved the way or fertilized the intellectual and cultural ground for the election of someone like Khatami.
Yeah.
And then Khatami's election itself opened up further channels, in a sense, because it then had the imprimatur of official state policy, not just underground.
Absolutely. I mean, we're talking here about Iranian reformists who were also part of the government or part of the system. But in the case of people like myself, we have always been outsiders, and we've been somehow civic actors who have never worked with the Iranian government, who have never been part of the system. But nevertheless, I mean, I'm happy that the civic actors and the Iranian civil society, Iranian intellectuals like myself at the time, we were somehow very helpful in bringing Khatami, for the election of Khatami.
Yes.
And of course, it's because a younger generation of Iranians were all influenced by all these intellectual and I would say civil society movements, women's rights movements, student movements, intellectual movements, and of course the reformist movement.
Yes, and then during the Khatami period, you continued to bring a series of major thinkers from around the world to Tehran to lecture, perhaps most notably Jürgen Habermas and the aforementioned Richard Rorty. Give us an idea, Ramin, of what that was like. I mean, for me, this was a turning point. When I read an interview with Habermas after his visit to Tehran, he went back to Germany. And he gave an interview to a German newspaper in which he described, and at that time he must have been already in his 60s or 70s, but he said, in all of my decades, a life of lecturing all over the world and meeting people, activists, thinkers, writers, he said, never before was I so inspired and so moved by what I experienced in Iran. And I remember Nader Hashemi, our mutual friend, sent me that interview, and I read it and I thought to myself, what exactly is he talking about? I've got to figure this out. Something fascinating, something really major is going on in Iran. What is it? I later found out it was you who brought Habermas to Tehran. Describe to our viewers what that was about. Why was Habermas's reception in Iran so electric?
Yeah, actually, I mean, I was working with the Iranian Cultural Research Bureau when we decided to bring Habermas. Actually, and after that, Roti and many others, and all of them actually, when they came to Iran, since for each meeting there was something like 2,000 people attending, they were finding themselves as philosophers. They said that we are like rock stars actually in Iran, because we don't never get more than 100 people in Europe or in the United States of America or in Canada for philosophy,
and I can
meetings.
confirm this because Habermas was a visiting professor at Northwestern University in Chicago, on and off for about a decade while I was living there, and I can tell you that his name almost never appeared in the Chicago Tribune or the Chicago Sun-Times. There was literally one article about him in the Chicago Reader, a much smaller paper. You ask the average, even educated Chicagoan, do you know who Jürgen Habermas is? Absolutely not. And then it turns out he goes to Tehran. There were thousands of people clamoring to hear his every word. What I hear is that there were people who couldn't get into the auditorium at the University of Tehran, but they stayed outside and listened through the loudspeaker system.
Absolutely. Same thing with Richard Rorty, same thing with Agnes Scheller, same thing with many of them. Actually, even somebody like Tony Negri, whom I invited later than these people, we had over 1,000 people attending, and they wanted to listen. Though even if the younger people had not read all these philosophers, they still wanted to discover them. That's the interesting part about Iranian civil society.
That
hunger for philosophy, hunger for questions, hunger for meeting new people. But that hunger already existed in the 1990s when we invited Paul Ricoeur. Paul Ricoeur actually also, he was quite surprised that there were so many people interested in his philosophy, which is quite a difficult philosophy. And I had a discussion with, I remember in 1995, that was, with the French ambassador in Iran, who insisted that Ricoeur has to speak only in French. And I said, well, there are more English-speaking Iranians than in French-speaking. Why don't he do he can do 2 of his lectures in English and 1 in French. And finally, that's how when we went and we did it. But Ricoeur was also very surprised to see so many people. So I think that, Iran is a special, contemporary Iran is a very special place, maybe because of its younger generation of Iranians, its demographic change, the fact that there has been a revolution, but at the same time, instead of people getting bitter, the younger generation, they got very, open-minded towards what they want to get from not only the West, but also the East. They are interested in reading books. If they have the capacity of making journals and magazines, they will certainly do it. They have been very active civically. I think Iran has the most vibrant civil society in the Middle East. Iran has, I think it has the most hopeful, I think, civil society for the future.
And this is really what fascinates me, Ramin. When you flash forward, however, to the year 2005, this, if you will, Tehran spring that we've just been talking about kind of comes to an end, or at least is suspended, shall we say, with the election of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. Now, you continued, however, to organize your events, your lecture series, hold these dialogues, and conduct, if you will, act as a kind of philosophical ambassador between Iran and the outside world. But the times had changed.
Yes.
And so the following year, 2006, you were arrested. And of course, this was an event that had a direct impact on my own life, because you and I had been engaged in a very long-form email interview that, thank God, was completed just before your arrest, and the interview was actually published while you were in prison, and it pained me deeply that I knew you would not be able to see our published interview until much, much later. But
yeah, I read your introduction to it,
Ah, wonderful.
Which was very touching, yeah.
Thank you. But Ramin, this memoir that you've just written, Time Will Say Nothing, deals not exclusively, but a lot of it takes place in your prison cell, in Evin prison. Before we get into that story, There was a line in the book that really struck me. You said that Evin prison represents the failure of 3,000 years of Persian culture. What do you mean by that?
Well, I think it's not particular for Iranian culture. I think, of course, in this case, I'm talking about a prison in Iranian culture, but I think prisons around the world, but also violence and cruelty that we see in different cultures, is actually the end of the civilizations. If we have it in American civilization, is practically the end of all good sides of the American civilization. What I think that has been done for short American history, but it's the same case for Islam and ISIS. And so I believe that Evin prison, the fact that Evin prison was not turned into a museum and it was not destroyed after the revolution, and it continued to be a place where people have been tortured, have been destroyed, executed, have been kept, like myself, in solitary confinement, is very anti-civilizational, because civilization, as Martin Luther King Jr. said, it's against violence. I mean, the two concepts don't go together. So if you have institutions which are promoting violence, they are not necessarily institutions which promote culture and civilization. So my impression was that putting people in a jail like Evin prison is not necessarily unlike what some hardliners in Iran, they think, it's not helping Iranian culture. It goes against actually Iranian history and Iranian culture, which actually we were talking about. Iranian culture is about open-mindedness. It's about opening up to others. It's about engaging a dialogue with others. And this is the true Iran that I've lived in. And this is a true Iran that I think that the younger Iranians want. So Evin prison, it goes against even the will and the wish of the younger generation of Iranians.
It's not the Iran of Hafez, if you will.
No.
And yet you say something very heavy and sharp on page 32 of your memoir, Ramin. You say, many of us Iranians deserve what we get because the revolution is responsible for what we have become, and we are responsible for the revolution.
Absolutely, because in the same way that Germans are responsible for Nazism, I mean, if I have to make the comparison, or the Russians are responsible for Bolshevism and the Russian Revolution, because revolutions are not done by UFOs or by Martians. They're done by the peoples. So it's done by their way of consciousness, their historical consciousness. But it's done also by their shortcomings. Most of the times, I mean, it's you have the ups and downs. When we talk about the American Revolution, French Revolution, Russian Revolution, Cuban Revolution, Iranian Revolution, these are great events in human history. But at the same time, you're talking about shortcomings. You're talking about cruelties in most of them. You're talking about wars. You're talking about imprisonment, executions. So I believe that in what I wrote, I believe that we need to go back in a very Hegelian way, meaning that we need to go back and look at our consciousness at that stage and be very dialectical and criticize ourselves and say, well, these are our shortcomings, so how should we overcome them? With what kind of consciousness, new consciousness, we have to overcome them? So I think that I don't believe in conspiracy theories. I don't believe in putting responsibilities on the shoulders of others. Some of my fellow Iranians, they would say that the Iranian Revolution was done by Americans or by Palestinians they say these kind of things, which is completely awkward and completely, untrue. But at the same time, I think that we have to think critically about the events which we participated in. Even though we are from the second or third generation of a revolution, as it happens today in Iran, we cannot say that we wash our hands from our history. It's part of our history. So history has good sides and bad sides. It means that in a history like a German history, you have Goethe and Heine, but you have also Nazism and Holocaust. In Iran, You have Iranian revolution is an anti-dictatorial revolution, is an anti-tyrannical revolution, which is a very good side to it, but it has also its shortcomings. So we have to think about it very critically, but how should we think about critically? And that's my whole point. We can do that only if we are in dialogue with other cultures, if we open up to other critical-minded people, and we bring in all these knowledge and we use it and we work with it historically.
Ramin, I want to ask you about consciousness, which you've just touched on, because one of the things that I find intriguing in your account of your time in prison is what's going on in the minds of your interrogators. Your descriptions of your interrogators are incredibly vivid. They're actually, I would say, very poignant, humanistic portraits. These are not monsters. These are not aliens, as you say. They're human.
Yes.
And yet, I'm left with some questions. Let me just read part of your description of your encounter with one of your interrogators, Haj Ali. You say, Haj Ali would arrive at Evin prison early each afternoon and ask the guards to take me out of my cell. He had made it his job to make a good Muslim out of me. Each time, once we were alone, he would tell me to remove my blindfold and to sit next to him on a carpet on the floor. And each time the conversation would revolve around religion and the fact that I had lost my faith in Islam. Once he looked me in the eyes and asked, "Do you consider yourself to be a true Muslim?" You then go on to, as a philosopher would, problematize and complicate what he means by that.
Yes.
But he's never satisfied. In fact, it
course.
frustrates him deeply. And, you know, reading this passage, Ramin, so many questions came to my mind. The fundamental question I want to put to you is this. In an age when everyone is debating now whether ISIS is Islamic or is it a perversion of Islam, I want to know, in your view, is Haj Ali and your other interrogators, are these people true believers? Because that's the sense I got from your account of those experiences, is that these people really believed it. They were not just thugs who were using religion as part of their thuggery, that they literally, truly, authentically believed that they were acting in the spirit of God in doing what they were doing.
I think that we need to distinguish, in the case of Iran, I think we need to distinguish between those Basijis, meaning part of those stormtroopers, Basijis, soldiers,
The paramilitaries, morality police.
Especially the paramilitaries and the soldiers who went to war against Saddam Hussein, and they got killed. They really believed that they were fighting for Islam. They really believed that they were fighting for Shiite Islam, and they were martyrs. But I don't think that someone who tortures, either psychologically or physically, a prisoner in prison, he or she really believes that he or she is practicing a religion. I think a true believer, for me, a true believer is somebody like Dalai Lama, Gandhi, and Martin Luther King Jr. Meaning, these are spiritual people, first of all. They have a sense of spirituality. They have a sense of giving meaning to their lives and lives of others. But at the same time, they bring in not what Gandhi used to talk about as organized religion, but as religion as ethics. You know, it's about alterity, it's about the otherness, it's about the other person, it's about sympathy, it's about empathy, it's about solidarity. These are all words that you use when look at somebody like Martin Luther King Jr., since we are in America, who talks about the beloved community. You know, the idea of beloved community is deeply spiritual. But why is it deeply spiritual, and why is it different from somebody who's torturing you, or somebody like Haj Ali who's asking me questions about? Because he wants me to bring me to a point to confess that I'm not a Muslim. But I mean, he cannot bring me to a point that I confess that I'm not a spiritual person. I'm a spiritual person. But you don't need to be religious a religious person to be spiritual. You can be a philosopher and be spiritual, you know.
But not under these conditions.
Not under those conditions, of course not. But under those conditions, I would say that it's enough to have, like Viktor Frankl says in his books about Auschwitz, it's enough that you have hope as a prisoner, or as a prisoner in Auschwitz or in Evin prison, that you want to continue life and you want to give meaning to life, and at the same time you're a spiritual person, you know. So, you know, I think that either we're talking about religion as a framework, or we're talking about religion and a dogma, or we're talking about religion as a search of meaning in life. Now, what's problematic about groups like Taliban, ISIS, Al-Qaeda is that there is no search for meaning in life, you know. They are always functioning in a very closed framework, which is either we kill because we want to construct a caliphate. My criticism of groups like ISIS is that they don't promote any civilization in Islam because they have no sense of a civilization in Islam. For them, Islam is not a civilization because they don't know anything about Islam itself. If you go and ask each one of them, each of these killers, or you know, the British guy who beheads the prisoners,
Jihadi John.
Yeah, Jihadi John. If you go and ask him about, do you know about Andalusian Islam? Do you know that there was an Islam in Cordoba? He has never heard of Cordoba. He doesn't know that there was an Islam in Andalusia.
Even though this is a rich part of Islamic history.
Absolutely, yeah. You ask him to name several mosques around the Islamic world, like the Sheikh Lutfullah Mosque in Isfahan. He has never seen it. You ask him about Islamic calligraphy. He doesn't know about that. Why do you think that they destroy museums? Because they have no sense of heritage. But Islam, like Buddhism, like Hinduism, like Christianity or Judaism, is part of the human heritage. So when you don't have a sense of human heritage or heritage of humanity, you can destroy Nimrud, you can destroy museums, you can destroy Buddhas in Bamiyan, as Taliban did.
But this is the question, Ramin. Do they believe what they are doing? They believe that this is part of the religion, at least as they understand it. In other words, they're not doing it for money. They're not doing it just for power. Do they not actually, you know, there's this debate now about Graham Wood's article in The Atlantic about what ISIS really wants, and he makes the somewhat controversial claim that cuts against the grain of much of the current, you know, zeitgeist.
Yes.
It cuts against the grain of what President Obama said, which is that this is a perversion of Islam. Graham Wood insists in his article, not that this is the correct interpretation of Islam, but that ISIS's worldview and its actions are Islamic in the sense that the texts and the doctrines that they derive from, that they draw upon, are Islamic texts and not non-Islamic texts.
Yeah, but the text doesn't show anything. I mean, you know, Nazis, they used German music and they used German culture. It doesn't mean that Beethoven, which was played by Furtwängler in front of Hitler for Hitler's birthday, we should not listen to Beethoven. And Beethoven himself was a proto-Nazi. Or, you know, reading a German philosopher would, or like Schopenhauer or Nietzsche, would make of him a proto-Nazi. I think that's nonsense. In the same sense, I would say it's not, you know, let me answer you by this, like this. It's not about believing, it's about what you do with your belief, okay? Because everyone can have a belief, okay? Everyone can have a faith. You can even have a faith in an ideology or not necessarily in God. But it's what we do with our beliefs in human history and in human lives which is important. Now, you have people like Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. and Abdul Ghaffar Khan and others who use their beliefs to enrich human solidarity, and you have people who use their beliefs to destroy human solidarity, you know, to create cruelty among humans, to create suspicion among humans. You know, these people who were in prison and they were torturing me psychologically, they are examples of people who can change from one regime to another because they do not believe in what we can call an ethics of empathy among humans. I think that what's important, and that's not only philosophy, I think philosophy, religion, arts, all of these pillars of human civilization, they have a great message, and the message is empathy and solidarity among humans. How should we live together? How should we learn to live together? Now, they destroy this idea, this logic of living together. And that's why we are in deep problem in today's world, because we have lost this logic of living together. We don't know, first of all, many young people around the world, in America, in North America, in Europe, in Asia, in Middle East, they don't know why they live. I mean, with an iPad or iPod doesn't give you the answer to why you live. You need philosophy, art, and religion to give you the answer about how you live and why you live, and why you live with human beings, and why you are born, as Hannah Arendt says, in a plurality among human beings. So that's the most important part to it. And I think that's my point. Violence doesn't solve anything. You know, you can go and kill people, members of ISIS, members of Taliban. Still, you don't give a meaning to the killers and to the people who kills them and to people who replaces them. And they do it because of lack of meaning. And I think that every prison is also a place where it doesn't give you meaning. You have to create your meaning by yourself as a prisoner.
That's one of the most compelling parts of the book to me, is the ways that you were able to weave together meaning. One of the most fascinating passages for me is when you describe the loneliness of solitary confinement, which you endured for a great deal of your time behind bars. And you talked about how that loneliness, that insufferable, unbearable loneliness, was somewhat mitigated by sounds that you would hear.
Yes.
The behavior of the ants, the sounds of the cockroaches.
Absolutely.
Things that we don't normally notice, that in a sense, solitary confinement actually heightened your senses and your awareness of other things, of nature.
Yes.
Even something that we would just take for granted or even find unpleasant, like cockroaches. All of a sudden, you felt a certain companionship with these creatures.
Absolutely. I mean, we are sitting in a university, and in university, if you have cockroaches around an auditorium, you will not acknowledge them, and even students might shout, and you go and kill them or ask them to throw them out. But when you're in a solitary confinement, and you have plenty of time, and you have cockroaches visiting you at night, you hear them, first of all, because it's silence. Secondly, you can engage in a dialogue with them. Thirdly, you don't feel the necessity in a prison where you or yourself, you're under cruelty to practice a cruelty against a living creature. And so it changes, you know, the context changes a lot.
And you were fascinated by the behavior of the ants, how
Exactly, the ants
seemingly happy they were going about their business. They're very, very occupied and communal creatures.
Yeah, well, I mean, they had a much better existence than I had. At least they knew how to communicate with each other and having a good life while they were running around, you know, the room. While I was sitting there all alone by myself, and I was trying to, you know, formulate a philosophy of life for myself, and trying to either read a book that I had on my hand, or to write a few words on the back of a Kleenex box or a
aphorisms.
Tissue box is aphorisms. So I mean, it's also a kind of consciousness. You know, Bruno Bettelheim calls this being in extreme situation. You know, like for example, he was in concentration camp, and he says, well, humans, they have this psychological mode in extreme situations, and their senses change. They have another way of looking at things. Now, so they can become cruel, or they can become hopeful, wishful, and they can become very empathetic towards their own, to other human beings, which is the case for somebody like Viktor Frankl. Let's help somebody else who's in need. But you can always also become very bitter, and somebody who is not going to help the other person, or you just want to go and get rid of that person.
Of course, the classic scenario in which an abused child becomes an abusive parent.
Absolutely. So the message which comes out from this book, which is my memoirs, was that I don't want it to become a bitter person, and I don't want violence, which I went through, to take over me and make of me a cruel person. So it added to my conviction in nonviolence that we need, despite all my weaknesses, despite all all the weaknesses that we might have in our private lives. You might get in anger, you might shout, you might even slap someone, but it's not organized violence. We don't. It's when we think about organized violence and how we want to manage our society in the future, like the Iranian society I was thinking of. Should I manage it in the same way, or should we think about new ways of managing our public spheres in the future? Same thing about Islam. I think that all the violence that ISIS, Taliban, Al-Qaeda, and others are showing us, it doesn't mean that we necessarily should take the path of cruelty, violence, or anti-violence, as we did it in Iraq, Afghanistan, invasions, doesn't solve any things, for the future generations. Actually, what solves it, I say the best message of America is Martin Luther King Jr. and not G.W. Bush. That's it. And that was in the debate I had with Richard Rorty, because for me, American dream is not about getting wealthy, okay? For me, American dream, the true American dream is Henry David Thoreau, Emerson, Martin Luther King Jr., people like that, who actually built America, the true America, in the way that it's an empathetic America. It's an America of solidarity, but it's also an America of opening up to others, and not an America which wants to only build ghettos around itself and thinks of putting wires against itself and securing itself against other cultures by saying, oh, we might be invaded by others, or we need to go and get rid of them before they get rid of us. I say, let us engage with them, but we need to have a culture for that. We need to open up, and it's true for countries in the Middle East. It's true for Saudi Arabia. It's true for Iran. It's true, in the long run, countries which don't open up, they destroy themselves. I always love this sentence by Gandhi. I want my house to be open to others' cultures, and the winds blow through my house, but I don't want my roof to be taken off by one culture. That's colonialism. That's imperialism.
So I have one final question
Yes.
for you, Ramin. Yes. Speaking of dialogue, the United States and Iran are now engaged in nuclear negotiations. This is a critical moment in those negotiations, as we saw with the visit of Prime Minister Netanyahu to Washington, his address to Congress, which was very controversial both internationally and domestically here in the United States. Ramin, as an Iranian intellectual and dissident who has spent time behind bars in Iran for your beliefs, what is your view of these nuclear negotiations and the nuclear deal that's on the table?
I really believe that the best way for the future of Iran, the best way for the peace in the Middle East, the best way for American people and Iranian people to get together and to understand each other in the near future is to sign the nuclear deal. Because I think that if the nuclear deal is not done, if it's not signed, if we don't go towards a dialogue, we might get towards a military solution and towards a war, a new war in the Middle East, and it's going to be, I think, problematic for everyone. I mean, not only Israel and Iran or Saudi Arabia, but I'm talking about the whole Middle East, including countries which are outside Middle East, like the United States of America. Why do I say that? Because I think that the future of the Middle East, first of all, Iran belongs to the future of the Middle East. Iran belongs to the peacemaking, process in the future of the Middle East. And I do not believe that Mr. Netanyahu belongs to the future of Israel. The future of Israel is a younger generation of Israelis, and the younger generation of Israelis, they are peacemakers, like the younger generation of Iranians. They are supposedly, at some point, they need to understand each other, have empathy for each other, know each other's cultures, as they did in the past. And they need to acknowledge the fact that they have a common history. Iran is a country of Esther and Daniel, Are you going to bomb a country where you have your own prophets buried in it? Is a sacred soil for the Jews, for the Iranian, not only Iranian Jews, for all Jews around the world. So, Israel is actually the country of birth of several Abrahamic religions. So it's actually blasphemy, even if we talk religiously, to engage a war between these two countries, which I don't believe in any kind of war. But I would say we need to go behind the misperceptions and stereotypes that we have been making, especially since September 11th, on Islam, on Iran, on the Middle East. We need to somehow add to our knowledge of all these different, either Middle East as a region, diversity of the Middle East, diversity of Muslims around the world. Islam, Shiite Islam has nothing to do, or Iranian Islam has nothing to do with Turkish Islam or with Saudi Islam, nothing to do with Islam in Morocco or in Tunisia. We need to understand this diversity. So we are not always talking about some kind of a homogeneous thing. It's very heterogeneous and diverse, and that's very important.
Very important. Ramin, one thing that I want to convey, though, to our viewers is that you're not alone as an Iranian dissident and human rights voice in favoring the nuclear negotiations.
No, I'm not.
And this is important because one of the claims that the neoconservatives, for example, in the United States make is that a nuclear deal with the regime in Tehran would sell the Iranian opposition short. It would leave them high and dry and betray them. And in fact, what I would like you to address in our final moments here is the fact that many Iranian dissidents, human rights activists, intellectuals, including some such as yourself who have been imprisoned,
Yes,
actually favor this deal.
absolutely.
And why is that?
Well, I mean, if I say that, they're going to go on Facebook and say, well, you are the spies of the Islamic Republic of Iran. But they have to understand that the hardliners inside Iran also, who are very much against the nuclear deal, it's because they don't want any opening up of the Iranian society. As the hawks in Washington, they don't want any opening up because they want to have enemies on both sides. They have to live with enemies, Neocons in Washington, D.C., they need their enemies to have their elections and to go forward with their own politics.
To pursue the politics of fear.
Yeah, to pursue the politics of fear and to have their think tanks as the American Enterprise Institute and the Washington Institute, which when you talk to them, you always feel this bitterness. And we were talking about empathy and understanding and knowledge, and not only bitterness. They call it realism, and this is not realistic at all. This is not pragmatic at all. I would call it ignorance. I would not call it pragmatism and realism. Actually, the real pragmatism and real realism is to consider and acknowledge the fact that Iran as a society, it has a very strong civil society. It's Iranian civil society, and not only one or two people, Iranian Americans living in Washington, D.C., Iranian civil society is favorable for the nuclear deal because they want opening up, economic, political, cultural opening up, and they want to engage in a peaceful dialogue with the West, with America, and Iran can play a very important peacemaking role in the future of the Middle East. Why do we make monsters out of people that we don't know and we don't understand? I would invite all these people, first of all, go open up a few books and read about Iranian history and Iranian culture before they open their mouths and they talk about this country, because they don't know. I know much more about America than they know about Iran. And if I engaged on American history with most of them, I would certainly know much more about American history. They don't know anything about Iran, and they permit themselves to talk about the Iranian people in the name of the Iranian people. But what is that? I think that everyone, all of us around the world, who are not warmongers, who do not want necessarily war and invasion, we are thinking of finding ways of peace and peacemaking, which is not through, and the nuclear deal is certainly a step forward towards this peacemaking, which I think some knowledgeable people in Washington, they have understood.
Ramin, what a pleasure it is to see you again and to have this
Thank you so
dialogue
much.
with you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation.